My name is Selena, I'm 26 years old, and this is the day my family drove a knife so deep into my back that I felt it pierce through to my heart. The words came through the phone like bullets, each syllable calculated to wound. On your brother's wedding day, it's better if you're not there. My mother's voice carried that familiar tone of cold authority, the same one she'd used when I was 7, and she told me Santa wouldn't come if I kept crying. Except this time, there was no Santa to disappoint me. Just the stark realization that the woman who gave birth to me had just erased me from the most important day of my brother's life. I stood there in my apartment, phone pressed against my ear, feeling something inside me crack and splinter. That was the moment I realized family can sometimes be the sharpest knife, wielded by the hands that are supposed to protect you, cutting deepest because you never see it coming. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in the United Kingdom, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in Australia, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The silence after she hung up was deafening. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that screams, that echoes with everything left unsaid, and everything that should have been said but never was. I remember staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again, waiting for her to call back and say it was all a mistake, that she'd misspoken, that of course I was invited to my own brother's wedding. But the screen stayed black, and that's when the rage started building in my chest like a fire that couldn't be contained. 26 years of being the daughter who tried too hard, who forgave too much, who swallowed every slight and smiled through every dismissal. 26 years of hearing Selena's always been difficult, and your sister has such strong opinions, and maybe if you were more like your brother. 26 years of being the family scapegoat, and now they were asking me to disappear entirely so their perfect son could have his perfect day. I yanked my suitcase from the closet with such force that it crashed into the wall, leaving a dent that I'd never get my security deposit back for. Not that it mattered anymore. Nothing mattered anymore except getting out of this suffocating city where everyone knew my family's version of who I was supposed to be. The packing was violent. I threw clothes into that suitcase like I was throwing punches, each item a small rebellion against their expectations. The red dress, they said, was too bold for family dinners. The books they called pretentious. The artwork they never understood. Everything that made me who I was. Everything they'd spent years trying to minimize and erase. When I slammed my apartment door behind me, the sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. It was the sound of bridges burning, of ties severing, of a daughter walking away from the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally, but had attached so many conditions that love had suffocated under the weight of them all. Sarah's couch smelled like vanilla candles and other people's lives. For 3 weeks, I slept there every night, staring at her ceiling and listening to the sounds of a real home laughter from the kitchen, gentle conversations, the kind of warmth that my family had forgotten how to create. Sarah tried to be supportive, bringing me cups of tea and avoiding the obvious questions, but I could see the pity in her eyes. The poor girl whose family threw her away like yesterday's newspaper. The mornings were the worst. Waking up in someone else's space, borrowing someone else's shower, eating someone else's food while trying to pretend I wasn't completely lost. Sarah would leave for work with a sympathetic smile, and I'd spend the day applying for jobs I didn't want in cities I'd never visited, anything to escape the suffocating bubble of my hometown where everyone knew everyone's business. The neighbors were already talking. I could feel their eyes on me when I walked to the corner store, could hear the whispers that followed me down the street. That's the daughter who wasn't invited to her own brother's wedding. I heard she had a falling out with the family. Poor thing, she must have done something terrible. Their assumptions carved into me like serrated blades. They looked at me and saw a problem, a cautionary tale, the daughter who must have deserved whatever punishment had been dealt. They didn't see the years of emotional manipulation, the constant gaslighting, The way my family had slowly and systematically eroded my sense of self until I barely recognized the person staring back at me in the mirror. Eating alone became a ritual of shame. I'd sit in restaurants with my phone propped up, pretending to be busy, pretending to be choosing to be alone while couples laughed at nearby tables and families celebrated birthdays I'd never be invited to again. The food tasted like cardboard, every bite a reminder that I was now officially the kind of person who ate dinner by herself on a Tuesday night in a diner that smelled like grease and broken dreams. The nights stretched endlessly. Hours upon hours of replaying every conversation, every argument, every moment where I could have been different, better, more palatable to the people who were supposed to love me regardless. I'd lie on Sarah's couch and feel the anger and shame colliding in my chest like opposing forces in a war that had no winners, only casualties. If you've ever felt abandoned by the very people meant to protect you, subscribe right now. Because silence only protects betrayal, and if you won't subscribe, at least say why in the comments. Tell me why standing against cruelty doesn't matter to you. But life has a twisted sense of humor, and sometimes the universe decides to shuffle the deck just when you think you know what cards you're holding. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was mindlessly scrolling through job listings, each one feeling more pointless than the last. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer anyway. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the hope that someone, somewhere, had something good to tell me for once. Is this Selena Martinez? The voice was professional, crisp, the kind that belonged to someone who dealt in facts rather than feelings. Yes, this is she. My own voice sounded hollow, like I was speaking from the bottom of a well. This is James Harrison from Harrison & Associates. I'm calling regarding your grandfather's estate. There's been a development that requires your immediate attention. My grandfather had died 8 months ago. The funeral had been another family gathering where I'd felt like an outsider looking in, where my grief had been overshadowed by everyone else's more dramatic displays of sorrow. I'd assumed all the legal matters had been settled, all the inheritances divided according to plan. I'm afraid I don't understand. I thought everything was finalized months ago. Mr. Harrison's pause felt loaded with possibility. There was a sealed addendum to the will that was only to be opened 6 months after the initial reading. It specifically pertains to the Riverside property, the land your family is planning to use for the wedding venue. The world tilted sideways. The Riverside property was the crown jewel of my grandfather's estate, 20 acres of pristine lakefront land that my family had been coveting for years. It was where my brother's wedding was supposed to happen in 3 weeks, where they'd planned every detail of their perfect day. What kind of addendum? My voice came out as a whisper. You inherit a controlling stake in the property, Miss Martinez. 51% ownership, with full decision-making authority regarding its use. Your family cannot proceed with any plans for the venue without your written consent. The phone slipped in my suddenly sweaty hand. I gripped it tighter, afraid that if I let go, this conversation would evaporate like a dream I was desperate not to wake up from. Are you certain about this? Absolutely certain. Your grandfather was very specific about the timing and the conditions. He wanted this information revealed only after the family had time to show their true character regarding your place in the family structure. My grandfather. The man who'd always listened when others talked over me, who'd remembered my birthday when my parents forgot, who'd seen something in me that the rest of the family had missed or ignored. Even from beyond the grave, he was protecting me, arming me with the tools I'd need to fight back. The shift in power was seismic. One phone call had transformed me from the discarded daughter sleeping on a friend's couch to the person who held the keys to my family's dream wedding. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. What do I need to do? I asked, and for the first time in weeks, my voice carried strength instead of defeat. I'll need you to come in and sign some paperwork, review the documents. But Miss Martinez, you should know your family has been calling our office repeatedly since yesterday. Apparently, they've learned about the addendum through their own legal channels. They're quite anxious to speak with you. I laughed, and it came out bitter and raw. I'm sure they are. Be honest, what would you do if the family that threw you away suddenly came crawling back? Subscribe if you'd make them wait. Comment if you'd shut the door forever. The calls started immediately. My phone, which had been eerily quiet for weeks, suddenly became a symphony of desperate ringtones. I watched their names flash across the screen like a slideshow of people I used to know. Mom, Dad, Michael, my brother. Even my Aunt Patricia, who hadn't spoken to me in 2 years, was suddenly reaching out with the fervor of someone whose world was crumbling. I let every single call go to voicemail. The voicemails were a masterclass in manipulation, each one escalating in desperation and absurdity. My mother started with her usual cold authority. Selena, we need to discuss this inheritance matter immediately. Call me back. But by the 5th message, her voice was cracking. Please, honey, we can work this out. Family sticks together. Honey. She called me honey. The woman who hadn't used a term of endearment for me in years was suddenly breaking out the pet names like they were ammunition in a war she was losing. My father's messages were predictably aggressive at first. This is ridiculous, Selena. You're being childish and vindictive. But even he descended into pleading by message 7. We made mistakes, okay? We can fix this. Just call us back. Michael's messages were the most infuriating. My golden boy brother, who'd never had to fight for love or attention, who'd watched our parents systematically exclude me and said nothing, was now panicking about his perfect wedding falling apart. Selena, please don't punish Jennifer for our family's problems. She doesn't deserve this. Jennifer. His fiancée who'd stood by silently when my mother announced I wasn't welcome at their wedding. Jennifer, who'd been planning her dream day on property that was now mine to control. The same Jennifer who'd never once defended me when my family made their casual cruelties look like jokes at family dinners. The emails were even more desperate. Subject lines like urgent, family matter, and please read, time sensitive, filled my inbox like digital panic attacks. I screenshotted every single one, documenting their desperation with the methodical precision of someone building a case. By day 3, they were sending texts every few hours. Long paragraphs of explanation, justification, and increasingly frantic bargaining. They offered money, apologies, promises to make things right without ever specifying what exactly they planned to make right or how. I showed the screenshots to Sarah over coffee, spreading my phone across her kitchen table like evidence in a crime scene. Look at this. 3 weeks ago, I was told I was better off not existing. Now I'm suddenly essential to their happiness. Sarah whistled low, scrolling through the messages. This is insane. They're completely losing it. Good, I said, and meant it. Let them lose it. Let them feel what it's like when the people who are supposed to love you suddenly become unreachable. My lawyer friend David had a different perspective when I met him for lunch that Friday. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the expression of someone who'd seen too many family wars fought in courtrooms. You know what you have here, don't you? He asked, cutting into his sandwich with surgical precision. Leverage. More than leverage. You have nuclear option level power over their entire event. But Selena, you need to think carefully about how you want to use it. Revenge can be satisfying in the moment, but it's usually the person seeking it who gets burned the worst. I stirred my soup, watching the steam rise like smoke signals from a fire I was just beginning to understand how to control. They spent years teaching me that family is conditional. That love comes with strings attached and can be withdrawn at any moment. Maybe it's time they learned that lesson themselves. David nodded slowly. Sometimes silence is the loudest weapon you can wield. Sometimes making them wait, making them wonder, making them confront the consequences of their choices is more powerful than any direct confrontation. He was right. Every hour I didn't return their calls was an hour they spent in their own personal hell, watching their perfect plans crumble while the daughter they'd discarded held all the power to save them. Every day of silence was a day closer to their wedding date with no venue access, no certainty, no control. The vendors started canceling on day 4. I learned this through a particularly panicked voicemail from my mother, her voice shaking with barely controlled hysteria. The caterer pulled out. They won't hold the date without venue confirmation. Selena, people are asking questions. The florist is threatening to cancel if we can't guarantee access to the property by Monday. The wedding was in 17 days. 17 days for my family to confront the reality that their casual cruelty had consequences, that the daughter they'd thrown away was now the only person who could save them from public humiliation. But here's the thing about power, it only means something if you're willing to use it. And after 26 years of being powerless in my own family, I was discovering that I had quite the appetite for watching them squirm. Don't just watch, stand with me. Subscribe right now if you believe silence is power. If you don't, then comment below and explain why letting villains win sits right with you. By the end of week 2, they'd moved from desperation to strategy. The dinner invitation came through David's office, formal and carefully worded, as if they'd consulted a team of negotiators on the exact phrasing. Mr. Harrison, we would like to invite our daughter Selena to dinner this Saturday evening to discuss the family matter in a calm, private setting. Please let her know that we hope she'll join us at 7 p.m. at La Bernardino on 5th Street. We've made reservations under Martinez. La Bernardino. The restaurant where they celebrated every major family milestone, where my father proposed to my mother, where they'd had my brother's engagement dinner. They were pulling out the big guns, invoking the sacred spaces of family memory as if nostalgia could heal the wounds they'd spent years creating. I spent Friday evening getting ready with the care of a general preparing for battle. I chose my black dress not because it was funeral attire, but because it made me look untouchable. Professional. Powerful. I did my makeup with precision, each stroke of mascara an act of armor application. Sarah watched me transform from her living room, her expression a mixture of admiration and concern. You look like you could run a Fortune 500 company or destroy one with equal ease. Perfect, I said, checking my reflection one last time. That's exactly the energy I'm going for. The walk into La Bernardino felt like a movie scene, the kind where the camera follows the protagonist in slow motion while dramatic music swells. The hostess recognized me immediately. After all, I'd been coming here for family celebrations my entire life. But something in my bearing must have changed, because she looked at me with new eyes, the kind of respect reserved for people who command rooms rather than shrink into them. My family was already seated when I arrived, and the tableau they presented was a masterpiece of calculated desperation. My mother had chosen her most maternal outfit, soft pastels designed to evoke nurturing warmth. My father wore his trustworthy patriarch suit, the one he saved for important business meetings. Michael and Jennifer sat close together, presenting a united front of young love under siege. The table was set with excessive care, fresh flowers, expensive wine already poured, the kind of attention to detail that screamed, "We're trying very hard to fix this." But their faces betrayed them. The smiles were too bright, the posture too rigid, the air thick with the kind of tension that precedes either reconciliation or war. When I approached the table, I could see them recalculating in real time. Whatever they'd expected. The broken, desperate daughter they'd left sleeping on couches was what walked through that door. I moved with purpose, sat with authority, and met each of their gazes with the kind of steady confidence that can only come from holding all the cards. "Selena," my mother began, her voice carefully modulated to hit just the right note of maternal concern. "You look wonderful." "Thank you." I didn't return the compliment. I didn't ask how they were. I simply existed in their space like a force of nature they'd have to navigate around. The conversation started with small talk, safe, meaningless observations about the weather, the restaurant, anything but the elephant sitting at the table wearing a wedding dress and holding a venue contract. But I could see them working up to it, building their courage, preparing their arguments like lawyers about to present to a hostile jury. My father finally broke. "Selena, we need to talk about this inheritance situation." "Do we?" I asked, cutting into my salmon with deliberate precision. I wasn't aware there was a situation. "Come on," Michael interjected, his voice carrying that familiar edge of frustrated privilege. "You know exactly what's happening here. You're holding our wedding hostage over some family drama." I set down my fork and looked at him for the first time in months. My brother, the golden child, the one who'd never had to fight for anything because everything had always been handed to him on a silver platter. The one who'd watched our parents systematically exclude me and said nothing because it didn't affect him. "Family drama," I repeated slowly, tasting the words like wine. "Is that what we're calling it now? Would you step back into the lion's den just to show them you're no longer prey? Subscribe if yes. Comment if no." The silence that followed was pregnant with years of unspoken truths, and I could see them all holding their breath, waiting to see which direction this conversation would go. My mother leaned forward, her hands clasped in front of her like a penitent in church. "Selena, honey, we know there have been misunderstandings." Misunderstandings. I let the word hang in the air like smoke from a fire they were trying to pretend wasn't burning down their house. "Is that what you call telling your daughter she's better off not existing?" "That's not what I said," my mother protested, but her voice lacked conviction. She knew exactly what she'd said, and more importantly, she knew I remembered every word. "Then what did you say, Mom? Please enlighten me. What were your exact words when you called me about Michael's wedding?" The table fell silent. Jennifer was staring at her plate like it might provide escape routes. My father was doing that thing where he adjusted his tie repeatedly, a nervous tell that had annoyed me since childhood. Michael was looking between his parents and me like a spectator at a tennis match where the stakes were his entire future. I said, my mother began carefully, that given the tensions in the family lately, it might be better if I wasn't there. I finished for her. "You said that on my brother's wedding day, it would be better if I wasn't there. Those were your exact words. And you know what the really beautiful part was? You said it like you were doing me a favor. Like excluding me from my own family was some kind of gift." My father finally found his voice, sliding into the authoritative tone he'd used to control family conversations my entire life. "Selena, you have to understand, there's been a lot of stress planning this wedding, and with your tendency to create conflict." My tendency to create conflict. I laughed, and it came out sharp enough to cut glass. "You mean my tendency to have opinions? To speak up when you said things that were cruel? To exist as something other than a smiling, silent decoration for your perfect family portrait?" "That's not fair," Michael said, his voice rising with the indignation of someone who'd never had his fairness questioned. "We're family. We stick together." I turned to him with the kind of calm that precedes storms. "We stick together? Where exactly were you when Mom and Dad spent the last 5 years making it clear that I was the family problem? Where was that stick-together energy when they systematically excluded me from every decision, every celebration, every moment that mattered?" "I tried to stay neutral," he said weakly. Neutral. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. "There's a quote I love, Michael. In matters of injustice, neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim." You didn't stay neutral. You chose their side by saying nothing. You chose their version of family over your sister, and now you're upset that your choices have consequences. Jennifer finally spoke up, her voice small and desperate. "Selena, I know this is between you and your family, but please don't punish me for their mistakes. This wedding, it's everything I've dreamed of." I studied her face, this woman who was about to marry into my family, who would spend decades navigating the same dynamics that had crushed me. Part of me felt sorry for her. Part of me wanted to warn her that she was marrying into a family that could turn love into a weapon and wield it with surgical precision. "Jennifer," I said softly, "did you know I wasn't invited to your wedding?" She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Did you say anything? Did you ask why? Did you suggest that maybe the sister of the groom should be included in the celebration?" She shook her head, and I could see the shame coloring her cheeks. "Then you participated in my exclusion. You may not have wielded the knife, but you held it steady while they drove it into my back." Your dream wedding was built on the foundation of my erasure, and now you're asking me to save it. The tears came then, and I watched them fall without a trace of sympathy. I'd spent too many years crying over this family's cruelty to waste any emotional energy on someone else's tears, especially tears that were falling because their cruelty had consequences. My father tried to regain control of the conversation, falling back on the authoritative patriarch routine that had worked so well for so many years. Selena, that's enough. We're family, and family means forgiveness. It means moving past these petty grievances and... Stop. The word came out with such force that conversations at nearby tables paused. Don't you dare talk to me about family. Don't you dare lecture me about forgiveness when you've spent years teaching me that your love comes with conditions. That I'm only acceptable when I'm convenient. That I only matter when you need something from me. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor with the kind of dramatic finality that marks the end of eras. Every eye in the restaurant was on us now, drawn by the electromagnetic field of a family imploding in real time. You want to know about family? I continued, my voice carrying across the dining room like a verdict being read. Family doesn't exclude. Family doesn't erase. Family doesn't tell one of their own that they're better off not existing. You taught me that family is disposable, that love is conditional, that I'm only valuable when I'm useful. Well, congratulations. I learned the lesson perfectly. I pulled out my phone and showed them the screen, dozens of missed calls, desperate texts, increasingly frantic voicemails. Look at this. Look at how quickly you remembered I existed the moment you needed something from me. Look at how fast disposable daughter became essential family member when your perfect day was at stake. My mother was crying now, ugly tears that smeared her carefully applied makeup. Selena, please, we can fix this. We can be better. Can you? I asked, and my voice was quiet now, deadly calm. Can you be better? Because I've been waiting 26 years for you to be better, and the only time you've shown any interest in change is when your happiness depends on my cooperation. I leaned down, close enough that only they could hear me, and delivered the words I'd been building toward for weeks. You taught me that family is disposable. Now watch how easily I dispose of your wedding. I straightened up, gathered my purse, and walked toward the exit with a kind of measured pace that suggested I was going somewhere important rather than running away. Behind me, I could hear the chaos beginning, frantic whispers, chairs scraping, someone calling my name with the desperation of a drowning person reaching for a life preserver. But I didn't turn around. I'd spent too many years turning around, going back, giving them another chance to love me properly. This time, I kept walking. The night air hit my face like freedom, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe fully. As I walked away from that restaurant, away from that table full of people who'd finally learned what it felt like to be powerless, I realized something profound. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was too hot, too consuming, too focused on them. What I felt now was something colder and infinitely more powerful. I felt justice. If you can hear this and still not subscribe, tell me why protect the abuser's side? Why stay silent when betrayal screams this loud? Drop your answer below. The wedding day arrived like a reckoning, dressed in white silk and accompanied by a string quartet that nobody would hear. I woke up that Saturday morning in my new apartment. Yes, I'd finally moved out of Sarah's place and into my own space, funded by a small loan against my newly acquired property rights. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's cruelty had ultimately led to my independence. I made coffee and sat by my window, imagining the chaos that was undoubtedly unfolding across town. No flowers, because the florist had canceled when they couldn't get venue confirmation. No catering, because the company refused to deliver to a location they couldn't legally access. No decorations being hung, no chairs being arranged, no altar being constructed for the ceremony that was supposed to begin in 6 hours. My phone had been mercifully quiet for the past week. After our dinner confrontation, they'd stopped calling. I'd heard through the small-town gossip network that they were exploring other venues, but everything was either booked, prohibitively expensive, or completely inappropriate for the scale of celebration they'd planned. The Riverside property wasn't just their first choice, it was their only choice that made sense. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Just drove past the Martinez house. There were cars everywhere and someone was crying on the front lawn. Thought you should know. I stared at that message for a long time, trying to identify what I was feeling. It wasn't satisfaction exactly, though there was certainly an element of that. It wasn't sadness, though somewhere deep in my chest there was a small ache for the family we could have been if they'd chosen differently. What I felt was something more complex, a sense of completion, like a circle finally closing after years of being left open and bleeding. The real devastation wasn't just the canceled vendors or the lack of venue access. It was everything that came after, the domino effect of their public humiliation spreading through our small town like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The guests started arriving at the Riverside property around 2 p.m., despite the fact that there was no wedding to attend. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it from 3 different sources who called me with updates like war correspondents reporting from the front lines of social disaster. Apparently, my family had tried to implement some kind of backup plan, a hastily arranged ceremony in my parents' backyard with folding chairs rented from the church and flowers picked from neighbors' gardens. But the scale was all wrong. The formality completely destroyed, and worst of all, everyone knew exactly why the venue had changed at the last minute. Where's Selena? I heard that question was asked repeatedly throughout the afternoon, whispered between clusters of confused relatives who couldn't understand how the sister of the groom could be completely absent from such an important day. My family, faced with explaining my absence, had apparently decided to spread some version of the truth that there had been family disagreements, and I had chosen not to attend. But small towns have long memories and sharp ears. Too many people had heard too many conversations, seen too many family dynamics play out over the years. The narrative my parents tried to construct of me as the difficult daughter who'd chosen to be absent crumbled under the weight of people's own observations. I always wondered why Selena looked so uncomfortable at family gatherings, I heard one neighbor had said. Now it makes sense. She was such a bright girl, but she always seemed diminished around them, said another. The bride panicked. Jennifer, faced with a backyard ceremony that bore no resemblance to the elegant affair she'd planned for months, apparently had what witnesses described as a complete meltdown. She locked herself in the bridal suite, my parents' master bedroom, and refused to come out for 2 hours, sobbing that her wedding was ruined and everyone would remember it as the disaster where nothing went right. Michael was furious, but his anger had nowhere to go. He couldn't yell at his parents without admitting they'd caused this mess. He couldn't blame Jennifer for being upset about the circumstances. And he couldn't call me, because he'd finally realized that he'd lost any right to my attention when he chose their comfort over my dignity. The guests whispered. Oh, how they whispered. I heard later that the afternoon was less about celebrating a marriage and more about analyzing the family dynamics that had led to such obvious dysfunction. People started remembering other incidents, other moments when they'd witnessed my family's treatment of me and chosen to look the other way. Remember at Christmas when they forgot to include her in the family photo? What about that time they planned the family vacation and didn't tell her until after they'd booked everything? I always thought it was strange how they talked about her when she wasn't around. My parents, faced with a reception full of people who were finally paying attention to patterns they'd previously ignored, were forced to confront the reality that their cruelty hadn't happened in a vacuum. People had noticed. People had questions. And now people were talking. The humiliation was public and complete. This wasn't just a failed wedding, it was a social autopsy of a family that had prided itself on appearances while rotting from the inside. Every conversation, every sideways glance, every early departure from the reception was evidence that my family's reputation in our small community had taken a hit it might never recover from. But the most beautiful part? I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to show up and gloat, Didn't have to make speeches or cause scenes. I simply existed in my absence, a ghost at their feast, a reminder that actions have consequences and cruelty always collects its debt eventually. Subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debt. If you don't, explain in the comments why betrayal should go unpunished. Monday morning brought the legal confirmation that transformed my moral victory into a literal one. The courthouse at 9 a.m. was a temple of institutional authority, all marble columns and echoing footsteps that announced the importance of the business conducted within. I dressed carefully again, professional attire that suggested I belonged in rooms where important decisions were made, where power was distributed, where justice was served. Judge Martinez, no relation, but the name coincidence felt like a cosmic joke, had reviewed all the documentation over the weekend. The inheritance was ironclad, drafted by lawyers who understood exactly how to protect their clients' wishes from challenge or interference. My grandfather had known exactly what he was doing when he'd structured the bequest this way. My family's legal team, yes, they'd hired lawyers to try to break the will, sat on one side of the courtroom looking like mourners at a funeral. My parents, Michael, and Jennifer had all come, along with two attorneys who'd clearly delivered news they hadn't wanted to hear. I sat with David on the other side, calm and prepared, watching them realize in real time that their last hope of salvaging their perfect wedding was about to evaporate like morning mist. Judge Martinez read the relevant sections of the will aloud, her voice carrying the weight of legal finality that makes courtroom pronouncements feel like divine decrees. The addendum clearly states that Selena Martinez shall inherit controlling interest in the Riverside property, with full authority over its use and access. The language is unambiguous, and the timing requirements have been met precisely. My family's lead attorney stood up, making one last desperate attempt to find a legal loophole in language that had been crafted to be bulletproof. Your Honor, with respect, the timing of this revelation seems specifically designed to cause maximum disruption to the family. Surely the intent was not to enable vindictive behavior. Judge Martinez looked at him with the expression she probably reserved for lawyers who'd clearly run out of legitimate arguments. Counselor, the intent was clearly stated in the will itself. The deceased wanted to ensure that his granddaughter's treatment by the family would be revealed before she gained control of assets they desired. The timing wasn't designed to cause disruption, it was designed to prevent exploitation. My grandfather, reaching out from beyond the grave to protect me one last time. The man who'd seen what my family really was and had taken steps to ensure they couldn't use my inheritance against me, couldn't manipulate me into compliance with the promise of money I'd never receive. Furthermore, the judge continued, the court notes that Ms. Martinez has made no attempt to use her inheritance for harassment or abuse. She has simply exercised her legal right to control property that belongs to her. The disruption to family plans, while unfortunate, is a consequence of the family's own choices, not the beneficiary's malicious intent. I remained silent throughout the proceedings, but I allowed myself a small smile at that moment. The judge, a complete stranger, had seen through their narrative more clearly than people who'd known our family for decades. She understood that I wasn't the villain in this story, I was the victim who'd finally found a way to defend herself. When they tried to argue that the inheritance should be contested, the judge shut them down with surgical precision. The will was properly executed, the addendum was clearly dated and witnessed, and the mental capacity of the deceased at the time of drafting has not been questioned. This court sees no grounds for contest. My parents' faces during that exchange were studies in devastation. They'd come here believing that legal pressure could accomplish what emotional manipulation had failed to achieve. They'd thought that judges and lawyers and official proceedings could force me to surrender property that was legally and morally mine. They'd thought wrong. The final ruling was delivered with a kind of clinical detachment that makes legal victories feel like natural laws being acknowledged rather than battles being won. Ms. Martinez retains full control of the Riverside property. No access shall be granted without her express written permission. I walked out of that courthouse feeling like I was floating 6 inches above the ground. Behind me, I could hear frantic whispered conversations, desperate planning sessions, the sounds of people who'd just learned that their last hope had died in a room that smelled like justice and old wood. They couldn't appeal, the law was too clear, the inheritance too solid, the evidence too overwhelming. They couldn't pressure me through official channels. The court had just confirmed that I was acting within my rights. They couldn't manipulate me through family connections. Those bridges had been burned so thoroughly that not even ash remained. For the first time in my adult life, I had power they couldn't take away, leverage they couldn't undermine, a position they couldn't attack. I was untouchable, and they were forced to confront the reality that their years of cruelty had finally caught up with them in a way they couldn't charm, threaten, or logic their way out of. As I walked down those courthouse steps, I realized that justice doesn't always come like lightning. Sometimes it comes like sunrise, slow and inevitable and absolutely unstoppable. Imagine watching your betrayers lose in front of the world. Subscribe if you'd savor that moment. If you would, comment why justice doesn't matter to you. 3 months later, I stood in the same spot where my brother's wedding was supposed to happen, but the landscape looked completely different through eyes that had learned to see clearly. The riverside property stretched out before me like a canvas of possibilities, 20 acres of pristine lakefront land that belonged to me now, completely and irrevocably. The grass had grown longer without event planners trampling it down, and wildflowers had started claiming patches of ground that would have been covered in white chairs and expensive decorations. It was beautiful in its natural state, undisturbed by anyone's dreams of perfection. The fallout from the wedding disaster had been more extensive than I'd anticipated. Small towns are ecosystems where reputation functions as currency, and my family had just declared bankruptcy in the most public way possible. Their business partnerships dissolved one by one as people reconsidered whether they wanted to be associated with a family that could treat their own daughter so cruelly. My father's construction company lost 3 major contracts when clients began questioning his character. If he can't build a healthy relationship with his own child, how can we trust him to build our homes? One former client had reportedly said. The logic was devastating in its simplicity. My mother's social circle had shifted dramatically. The women who'd once sought her opinions on everything from party planning to parenting advice suddenly seemed to have other priorities, other friends, other places to be. Cruelty, it turns out, isn't as attractive when it's exposed to sunlight. But I wasn't focused on their destruction. That chapter had closed the moment I walked out of that restaurant, and I'd spent the months since then learning what it meant to build a life based on my own values rather than their expectations. I'd started dating someone, a teacher named Marcus, who'd never met my family and had no context for their version of who I was supposed to be. He knew only the woman I'd become after walking away from their influence, and he seemed to like that woman very much. Our relationship was built on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than conditional love, on the revolutionary concept that 2 people could support each other without keeping score. I'd found my own chosen family among friends who celebrated my victories, supported me through difficulties, and never once suggested that my worth was dependent on my usefulness to them. Sarah, David, Marcus, a growing circle of people who'd seen me at my lowest point and chose to stick around not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The property itself had become something unexpected, not just a symbol of my grandfather's love, but a space where I could imagine my own future. I'd started hosting small gatherings there, barbecues with friends, sunset picnics with Marcus, quiet afternoons where I could read by the water and feel completely at peace. Sometimes I thought about developing it into something bigger, a retreat center maybe, or a venue for events that celebrated chosen family rather than biological obligation. There was poetry in the idea of transforming a space that had been withheld from me into something that welcomed others who'd been excluded or overlooked. But mostly, I just enjoyed the silence. The absence of criticism, judgment, conditional love, and emotional manipulation. The space to breathe fully, to think clearly, to make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what would avoid conflict. I'd learned that peace isn't just the absence of war. It's the presence of safety, the knowledge that you don't have to defend yourself against the people who are supposed to protect you. It's waking up in the morning without immediately calculating what mood everyone else is in and how that might affect your day. It's discovering that your own company can be not just tolerable, but genuinely enjoyable. The healing journey wasn't linear or simple. There were days when I missed them, not for who they actually were, but for who I'd always hoped they could become. There were moments when I questioned whether I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to burn bridges instead of building them. But then I'd remember the phone call. On your brother's wedding day, it's better if you're not there. I'd remember the years of systematic erosion, the casual cruelties, the way they'd trained me to accept less and less until I'd almost forgotten that I deserved more. And I'd remember that some bridges need to burn. That some relationships are so toxic that the only healthy response is distance. That family can be a beautiful word when it's practiced with love and respect, but it becomes a weapon when it's used to justify abuse and demand compliance. I'd built something better than what they'd offered me. I'd created a life where love wasn't conditional, where my value wasn't constantly questioned, where I could exist fully without having to minimize myself for everyone else's comfort. The best revenge, I'd discovered, wasn't making them suffer, it was proving that I could thrive without them. It was building a life so full and satisfying that their absence became irrelevant rather than painful. It was learning to love myself with the consistency and unconditional acceptance they'd never been able to provide. 3 months after the wedding that never happened, I was happier than I'd been in years. Not because they were miserable, but because I'd finally learned what it felt like to be free. What would you have done in my place? Drop your answers in the comments. And if you can hear this story and not subscribe, at least be honest, why turn away from truth when it's right before your eyes? Looking back now, 6 months after that phone call that changed everything, I can see the story with the clarity that only comes from distance and healing. The extended aftermath revealed patterns I hadn't expected. My family's social isolation deepened as people in our community began sharing their own stories of witnessing casual cruelties they'd previously overlooked. It turned out that their treatment of me wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of behavior that extended to neighbors, employees, anyone who couldn't fight back effectively. My father's business partner dissolved their partnership after realizing that the same man who could systematically exclude his own daughter might not be trustworthy in financial matters. My mother lost her position on the hospital charity board when other members decided they didn't want someone with such obvious family issues representing their organization. But here's what I found most interesting: their attempts to rehabilitate their reputation revealed exactly who they really were. Instead of genuine self-reflection, they launched a campaign of image management that focused on making themselves look better rather than actually becoming better. They started volunteering conspicuously at local charities, posting photos on social media of their good deeds, talking loudly in public about the importance of family and forgiveness. It was performance art masquerading as personal growth, and most people saw right through it. Michael and Jennifer had quietly divorced 4 months after their backyard wedding disaster. Apparently, the stress of the situation had revealed fundamental incompatibilities in how they handled crisis, conflict, and family loyalty. Jennifer, to her credit, had reportedly told mutual friends that she'd begun to understand why I distanced myself from the family after experiencing their dysfunction firsthand. The property remained mine, and I decided to lease portions of it to a local environmental education center. Children came there now for school trips, learning about water ecosystems and native plants, experiencing nature in a space that had once been reserved for artificial celebrations of relationships that looked beautiful from the outside, but were hollow at the core. I'd also started speaking not publicly, but in private conversations with friends and colleagues who found themselves in similar situations. People dealing with family members who confused love with control, who used guilt as a weapon, who made their acceptance conditional on compliance. My story became a roadmap for others trying to navigate the complex terrain of family relationships that had become toxic. The most profound discovery of this entire experience was learning the difference between being alone and being lonely. I'd spent years feeling lonely even when surrounded by family, desperate for connection while being surrounded by people who consistently demonstrated that their love came with strings attached. Now, building relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection, I rarely felt lonely even when I was by myself. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to value my own opinions, to take up space without apologizing for my existence. These might sound like small victories, but for someone who'd been systematically trained to doubt herself, they represented revolutionary changes in how I moved through the world. The property itself had become a sanctuary not just for me, but for others seeking peace from family drama. I'd hosted informal gatherings for friends going through divorces, dealing with difficult relatives, or simply needing a place where they could exist without judgment. It had become what I'd always wanted my family home to be, a place where people felt welcomed, accepted, and valued exactly as they were. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if they'd made different choices along the way. If they'd apologized genuinely instead of strategically. If they'd acknowledged their patterns instead of defending them. If they'd chosen to grow instead of just trying to manage their image. But those were hypothetical questions about people who didn't exist. I'd learned to love my family for who they were while protecting myself from who they were. I could feel compassion for their limitations while refusing to make their limitations my problem. The phone still rang occasionally, usually around holidays or family birthdays, tentative attempts to rebuild bridges they'd burned themselves. I'd gotten good at listening to these messages without feeling obligated to respond, at recognizing manipulation disguised as reconciliation attempts. My new life had taught me that family isn't just about shared DNA, it's about shared values, mutual respect, and the choice to show up for each other consistently. I'd found that kind of family among friends who'd proven their loyalty not through blood relations, but through actions, support, and unconditional acceptance. The best part about this new chapter was that it was mine. Not a reaction to their treatment, not a rebellion against their expectations, but a life built on my own values, dreams, and vision for what relationships could look like when they were healthy. I'd stopped waiting for them to love me properly and started loving myself properly instead. I'd stopped hoping they'd change and started changing what I was willing to accept. I'd stopped trying to earn their approval and started approving of myself. 6 months after that phone call, I was living proof that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a toxic family is to remove yourself from their ability to hurt you. That sometimes the kindest response to cruelty is to protect yourself from it rather than trying to cure it. My name is Selena, I'm 26 years old, and this is how I learned that sometimes family can be the sharpest knife, but you don't have to keep letting them cut you. You can choose to step out of range. You can choose to build something better. You can choose to prove that their version of love was never love at all, because real love doesn't require you to disappear to make other people comfortable. And sometimes, the most powerful revenge is simply living well without them. Subscribe, not for me, but for every person who's been silenced by family cruelty. If you want, then at least comment and admit why you refuse to stand against betrayal when you see it happening right in front of you.